Okay, we are ready as soon as we get online. Yep.
Joked about stuff like that. No more than joking about. Table been and ready to go. It's. When you're ready to bad when it's moving forward.
Okay, let's go ahead and call this meeting to order. Let's go ahead and do the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Hey everyone, welcome to our first budget meeting of the year. For those that have never been a part of a budget committee, the way we will do this is if I'm opening a meeting, but we will now be electing a budget committee chair who will take the gavel from me and technically lead the meeting from here on out. So I only go up in the beginning. So beyond that, now we got to, is there anyone who would like to nominate anyone for committee chair?
I'll nominate Andrea.
Andrea? Okay, I will second that nomination. I know you're gonna get railroaded in there. Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of appointing Andrea as the committee chair, say aye. 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 All those opposed, say nay.
All right.
Just follow the script in front of you and you'll be good.
All right, so it sounds like we have a chair elected. Are you all ready for me to dive in?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yes, is it the budget message?
Yeah.
Very good. Yes.
All
So
right.
let me introduce myself first. For those of you who have not met me before, I'm Krista Bosserman-Wolf. I am a consultant and have been working with Hubbard for the last year. And so I had the opportunity to help Hubbard with their budget again this year and got the chance to work with Sean, your new city administrator, and she is awesome. And so I'm going to be delighted to hand the reins over to her going forward. So without too much more information, I'm just going to share really quick that I do have a cold that I'm getting over. So I do apologize if there's any coughing or drinking of water or any of that. It's not the best thing for camera, but life happens, right? So just want to give you guys that quick heads up. And then, of course, if the committee has questions, feel free to interrupt me, pause. We can ask questions as we go or hold that discussion towards the end. It's really, however, the budget committee today and our chair, Andrea, wants to run the meeting. Just wanted to let you know that I'm absolutely open to questions at any time. So a couple orders of business. And then my last thing I want to let you all know is, while I believe you can see me because we tested this a little bit before we got the meeting going, I cannot see you all. So I can hear you. So please kind of bear with me from that technological standpoint of it's kind of hard sometimes when you can't see someone directly. So I can't really connect a face with a name in this particular situation. Okay, so with that, I would like to go over the budget message. So in your packet, one of the first documents you'll see is the budget message. And this is sort of the high level overview of what are the major things that have happened and that we're anticipating happening for the upcoming fiscal year with the city. So, you know, if I am a citizen, this is a great place to go. If I don't want to look through, 68 pages of detailed budget documents, but I want to get a high level overview, then I would recommend looking at the budget message. This is going to have just the high level information. So the city, we have proposed a budget in accordance with the goals and policies that as understood by management, so consistent with the prior year. And the total resources are 12.9 million, of course, with total requirements also equaling 12.9 million. So we have to have a balanced budget under local budget law, and this is meeting that requirement of our resources are equaling our expenditures or our requirements. The beginning fund balance that we're estimating is going to be, we're estimating about 7.7 million for the city overall, but about 1.8 for the general fund. And the general fund is where the majority of the operations happen, right? And so we need that estimated cushion, that carryover, if you will, to be able to fund operations. So cities don't have paychecks like employees do, for example, right? When you're a city, you're dealing with property taxes, and you'll have a lot of your funding for the new fiscal year will happen in November, where the bulk of the payments will come in. And you've got to kind of be able to pay for operations and continue to provide our services to our citizens and our residents during that time frame of July until November. And so that is why we have this beginning balance and carryover of the 1.8 million in general fund for the operations. Something slightly different from the prior year is we also have the ARPA funds included in the proposed budget. Last year, for those of you who were here, you might recall the ARPA funds were not included at that point in time because the city had the transition of different consultants, one going off, me onboarding, right? And we didn't have adequate time to include the ARPA funds in the prior year budget. So that's a small difference that you'll see. In addition, the city has also received an allocation of up to $1 million in ARPA funds through Marion County. And that's in addition to the direct payments that were coming from the state of Oregon. And council has already had meetings to discuss how these expenditures would be made. And I am sure there is plenty of information in previous meetings around that. Okay, staffing. One of the biggest expenditures we know in running government ultimately is the cost of personnel. This is always a big interest. When we talk about staffing, some of the things that you're going to see is that we have a COLA, the cost of living. Sean did some work around this and looked into it, and CPI was coming in at the 8.25. However, we have proposed a COLA of 6.88%, with exception to the city administrator position. Sean has asked to not have a COLA applied to her position in particular. So overall, we were able to hold that personnel cost increase to about 4%. And this is due to kind of a combination of certain things. There were some vacancies. And with those vacancies, we re-looked at the actual costing of those positions and were able to refine that a little bit more, which kind of led to some decreases in particular as we estimated things like insurance benefits and the actual what step would that new personnel come into that position at, as well as then we did still have the increases on the other side of the COLA, and it was a PERS year, so there was a small increase with PERS as well, and a modest increase in insurance, which not surprising, most of us see insurance rates on a personal level go up every year, so this is something we're seeing as well. And then another significant change, as outlined in this letter as well, is just that the council was able to fill the city administrator position at the end of March. And so Sean Waite has come on board. And this is kind of creating and following that recommendation from prior consultant the city had of Summer Sears, and then also myself, as you are working to fill the finance gap that had existed from the vacant position of finance manager, finance director, but then also providing a little bit more structure to the city as well. This also has some additional information about land use and economic development. No major changes, I think, in that area from the prior year. The general fund here is highlighted with a chart, just because we like to kind of see where we've been and where we're going. So general fund operations, as we look at beginning fund balance, we have a nice estimate again for this upcoming proposed budget of about the thinking, okay, we're going to come in at about 1.8 million. And that's great because that's like a continued growth pattern that we've seen in history. And the projections, you'll notice they kind of taper off over time. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as we sort of go through more details of why would that general fund balance begin to decline. And then the next page, we talk again more about the general fund in terms of, do we have a surplus? Meaning, is there extra funds at the end of the year? Or do we have a deficit position? And you can kind of see from the history here, as you're following along, that in the letter here, you can see that we've had some ups and downs, largely mostly positive, and then you'll see some red bar charts headed off to the side there as we look out to the future. And again, we'll talk about that more later in the presentation, but this is more a long-term trend potentially if we don't make some changes. And then as far as property taxes, the main funding for the city. So this is really important, right? Is property taxes, again, is really the main source of funding. We're still estimating a growing property tax environment and rate in government and here in Oregon. So I think that's the positive news. Unfortunately, it's just not keeping pace with inflation, right? There's only so much growth that is going to happen during the course of the year. So we've estimated 4%, which is probably a little conservative. It may come in higher because Marion County did note this year that there are some new developments happening. And so if Hubbard gets any piece of that development, things might look better than we've actually budgeted. So I would say we've budgeted conservatively in the area of property tax revenue. And so overall, I give a recommendation here, just we're in an environment of continued rising costs, and we're going to continue to have expenditures that outpace our revenue sources. Like this is just a national trend. It happens personally, I think, with our budgets. It's happening nationally with budgets. And so this is something I wanted to point your attention to. If we were to leave it unchecked, eventually our fund balance here at the city could be eroded, right? And so we'll have to talk about ongoing solutions potentially. And then the next page of the letter highlights some accomplishments and challenges for the Public Works Department, and then some of the projects that they are planning to budget as well, as including project updates, methodology updates for the upcoming year. Additionally, I think it's worth noting that the wastewater loan from DEQ was paid off in fiscal year 22-23, which freed up additional debt capacity for the city. And so that's a really positive thing. When a city is able to use some of its resources to make debt payments, again, it frees up capacity should you need to undertake a new project. You'll be able to take out debt, especially since these are dedicated revenue sources in the area of the water and wastewater operations. So I think that's really positive because it's giving the city, again, opportunity to undertake additional projects. And then just a little note here about some of the ARPA funds have been dedicated to assist with water and wastewater replacement projects. The police department, there is an increase in their budget, not surprising. It mostly has to do with personnel at the end of the day. Again, that is just a normal part of what we see in local government in the area of public safety. Again, their budget is largely personnel with a few capital expenditures here and there for their equipment or vehicles. But this increase, I would say, is largely due to personnel. So final thoughts in this letter. Of course, I just want to acknowledge the hard work of everyone at the city. Everyone has been great to work with. So that is something that I really enjoy as a consultant, is being able to work with dedicated staff, people who are responsive, people who are caring. And so I see that at Hubbard. And so I really do enjoy working with the team here. And I just wanted to pass along that information to the committee, that you have a really great group of dedicated staff here at the city. So you're very fortunate. So I think that covers the main highlights of the budget message that I wanted to share. I do have a fun PowerPoint presentation, but I like to pause at this moment to see if there's any questions on the budget message.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay, doesn't look like there's any questions.
All right, thank you. I will go ahead and try to share my screen now. And you all can let me know if it works or doesn't. Okay, let's see. Let's see if that does it. And I need to have my controls too. All right. Can you all see my screen with a pretty presentation PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. That's great. I appreciate the feedback. All right, so this is when I want to kind of go through the highlights after we share the budget message. Kind of our next step is to present the budget, which in some governments, it is like, hey, you open the book and you go through everything line by line in detail, right? And so I am bringing my experience into Hubbard and sharing a PowerPoint, much like I did last year. So those of you who were here last year, you're like, oh, this looks familiar. Yes, this should be familiar, very much the same format, similar information. But this is an easier way to digest the information. And then after we go through this, if the committee then at that point says, we'd like to open the book and to look into some line items or have additional discussion or bring the department heads up, then I think that will be a great time to do that. But I'm hopeful this will have a lot of good high level information that will be helpful. So first off, just kind of a quick reminder of why do we have a budget committee, role of the budget committee. Again, so ORS is Oregon State Revised Statutes, right? They're trying to tell governments you need to be transparent. You need to involve the public in the process. So this is why we have public meetings for budget committees, for adopting budgets, for hearings, and why we are having a committee to get them in, get you all involved in the process, right? You really have that role of promoting transparency. So asking questions is great, reviewing the proposed budget, and then again, revising it if need be. So if the committee says, hey, this is great, Krista, but we really need more funding in this area, then that is the committee's job and role, and you certainly are able to do that. And then I would take direction and staff would take direction from the committee to make changes as needed. So first off, just kind of reiterating, it is a balanced budget. So this is a snapshot from the budget document. It is showing you kind of the information of all fund summary where we have total resources and total requirements, and they equal. So this is kind of one of those key things in budget law. We can't have 12.9 million and then 12.2 million. That doesn't work. So you're going to see that everything adds up there. This is all funds combined, so not just one particular fund. The city has multiple different funds. We follow governmental accounting, which is fund accounting, which means that each separate kind of large activity needs to be separately accounted for. Each has its own separate self-balancing set of accounts, a trial balance, financial reports, all the things that you would expect maybe a business to have, except think of it as, 12 businesses, 20 businesses instead of one business, which means that I think the people who do the work in finance and government, we're very special. We're special breed because it takes a certain kind of person to actually to like doing this work. And I will admit, I'm one of those people who actually like doing it. So my friends and I, we say we're accounting geeks because we enjoy it. So with this information, you can see it's going to highlight all the major categories. You're seeing beginning fund balance, which we talked a little bit about in the message. An estimate for property taxes to coming in at over $1 million, franchise fees, licensing and permits, charges for services, intergovernmental revenue. That means that there's revenue sources coming from other local governments or other government agencies. So it could be federal, state, Clackamas County, Marion County, that kind of thing. So that's what that means. And then we have grant revenue separated out, fines and fees, miscellaneous, and transfers for other funds. Those are things like payments. So another fund may need to pay back the general fund and say for SDCs, or it may need to transfer in funds to cover administrative expenses that are happening in the general fund. On the expense side, we still see personnel. The materials and services costs include things like contracts, like office supplies, that type of thing. So kind of think of like your some of your overhead expenditures. Capital outlay, those are going to be things like large projects, new vehicles, building repairs, improvements, that sort of thing. And then we've got some debt service payments to make. And I believe that is the last payment for the police department on a vehicle, I believe. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong at the city. And then we have special payments. That is a very unique category under local government's law here as far as budget law. So those tend to be our payments that we are making out to nonprofits. Meaning the city is not receiving necessarily a benefit, and that can be traced to that. It's not like we bought office supplies and I get pencils. There's no reciprocal relationship per se in those types of transactions. So it's a special payment. And then we have transfers. Those are transfers out to other funds. The general fund is moving dollars to other funds, or other funds are moving dollars to the general fund, whatnot. That's interfund activity. Contingencies, those are dollars that are available to be dipped into during the course of the year. So if, for example, the water or wastewater operations needs additional project money and in their capital outlay, and it wasn't budgeted because the cost, was unforeseen, then essentially they could come back to the board and say, hey, we need access to the contingency dollars. And we would go through a process outlined in local budget law to move contingency dollars into capital outlay. That is what that accomplishes. And then we have reserves and ending fund balance. So let's talk a little bit about what was assumed in this budget document in front of you. So you have this large budget document. It's built with a thought, an idea, and a process. So for revenues, there's no new revenue sources per se in the budget. I would say with the exception of the ARPA revenues are included in this budget, whereas last year they were not originally included, and we had to go through the process of doing a supplemental budget process to add those. The property tax growth, it's assessed at 4%, meaning we estimated 4%. Like I said earlier, a little bit on the conservative side. It may come in higher. If it comes in higher, great. That's awesome, right? State shared revenues, those we estimate from the League of Oregon Cities annual report that they provide. They get the information from the state, have a really good understanding of what is available to be spent, and they provide the information on a per capita basis. So they basically say, City of Hubbard's population is X. This is the rate that we're going to pay for this state shared revenue. And then the finance department, we just do simple math to come up with an estimate of what that's going to be. So on the expenses or expenditure side, we have personnel. We assume that vacant positions were going to be budgeted as filled for the entire year. So there's no vacancy rates included in this particular budget. And really what that means is we're assuming that every position is filled and incurring the full cost as of July 1st, rather than in building in a vacancy rate, which assumes, like, for example, that a position may remain vacant for the entire year based off prior history, or that maybe prior history shows that with turnover, there's a pattern of we always have 7% of our positions vacant or 4% of our positions vacant, and then building that into the forecast and assumptions for the budget. So step increases were included as well. So when it's appropriate and we have that information, and for certain positions that are on steps and that are not topped out, then we'll factor in this employee is eligible for a step increase, and we put that into the budget as well for personnel. And then, of course, we have the COLA that we talked about earlier, and then the PERS increase and medical increases. So respectively, PERS increased almost about 2% over the prior biennium. So, I mean, out of PERS, that's a small increase, fortunately, but we know PERS in total is a big number. And then medical went up about 5%. And I think we're seeing medical just trend higher overall. Inflation has just been brutal this last year, and the cost of everything is going up, from milk in our grocery stores to our medical care. And then we have our materials and services and capital outlay accounts. As far as those, the departments largely budget that information themselves. They say, hey, Chief Rash at the PD will say, hey, this is what I need in each budget category, in each line item. So they kind of put that information together. On the items where I forecast, it would be like things like utilities, so PGE bills and things like that. So we've assumed a 5% inflation rate over the prior year. Last year, we assumed really high, went with 8% because inflation was trending so and it was just skyrocketing at the time last year. So brought that down a little bit because things have slowed a bit. I mean, inflation is still high, but is a little bit leveled off as far as its trend. And then we have a 9% increase for liability insurance, and that is from CIS, which is the city's provider. And they let us know ahead of time what is the expected increase in rates. So that's a known cost. So property taxes, I like to kind of share a little bit of history and estimates, kind of give you a bit of a picture here when it comes to property taxes, and you can see where we've been. So actual collections are still trending upward, which is what we want to see. It's looking really good. So recently we're seeing that the city has now broken that $1 million mark. So that's pretty exciting. It's kind of almost historic when you hit those big numbers. And so estimating, of course, increased growth, and then as well out into the future proposed as well. So we're just kind of continuing that upwards trend. So when we look at the tax rolls, property taxes are calculated on assessed values, right? So if you get your property tax statement at home, you are getting a letter and it says, hey, here's your AV and here's your bill, right? And we probably don't think too much more of it other than, wow, I have to pay my property taxes again when you're at home doing daily life. So really what you see is that, when we're calculating and forecasting this, is we're looking at assessed values, and then we're looking at the city's permanent rate that it gets to levy for property taxes. And then we have to factor in things like how much is actually collectible. What is the collection rate? Because although this much is assessed, what will the city actually receive? Because some of those property taxes will be delinquent. They will be late. Life happens and not everyone's going to be able to pay their property taxes. So we take that into consideration when we do this forecast. And as noted here, the collection rate for Hubbard is really quite good. It's still about 97% year over year, which is great. So just a little note about increases on just the trends, what we're seeing here. Overall, we're going to continue to see increases. Like, this is just part of where we're at and part of the process. And this is something that all local government is experiencing. So personnel services honestly did quite well with holding that only at 4%. And then we've got materials and services overall increasing by about 6% and capital outlay by about 3%. So I think those are really modest when we look at everything all together. This is that sort of detailed graph that we saw earlier in the budget message. And this is our general fund. So we're looking at what is going to happen if we sort of continue spending funds with the current resources the city is receiving at the same rate. Like, we're not really changing much as far as the current proposed budget. So there is a little bit of a cliff here. And there's that question mark of, will this cliff really happen? Will we really fall off the edge and have this happen? And so this is going to be what I would say an opportunity. So rather than looking at it as a negative, I would say it's an opportunity. Something Sean and I have been talking about is there are things to look at and consider. So whether that is increasing revenue sources, looking at raising, particular rates and fees, or generating new revenue sources, like looking at levies. The other things that could be looked at is, well, when we do these budgets and forecasts, what is the vacancy rate at Hubbard? What are we normally seeing? How long does that position stay vacant? Because we know it's really hard to hire people right now. And so again, this budget is presented right now, assuming you've got 100% staff filled July 1st. That's what this clip is showing. It says, well, if everything was equal and revenues just stayed the same, didn't really go up much other than property tax growth year over year, and you had a full staff all the time, then we would start to see this sort of cliff and into the red situation. I think that's not really happening right now. You have had vacancies on a fairly consistent basis, and we have also seen continued revenue growth and property taxes. And then I've also kind of seen a little bit of a trend of departments actually underspending their budgets rather than overspending. So, which is a good thing as well. And so we really haven't materialized any of this red or the cliff, more or less. So I think that's positive. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about contingencies, reserves, and unappropriated fund balance, because these are kind of clunky terms. It's prescribed terminology that we have to use in local budget law here in Oregon. So I'm just going to kind of run through these so we all have a common understanding. So what's an operating contingency? These are what we call contingency funds. It can only exist in an operating fund. So it means we're going to have personnel and everything happening in this fund, revenues, personnel. So not something that would happen like in a reserve fund, for example, where you're just setting aside funds, saving for something. So we've calculated contingency in the operating funds at 15% of operating expenditures. And that is something I noticed was a similar practice, but it has not been established necessarily in policy yet with the city. But I've kind of continued that trend of keeping on with consistent practice. And so I've seen that trend of about 15%, and this budget's proposed with the same. Operating contingencies, they are appropriated by the governing body. So meaning if we go through this budget process today and the committee approves the budget, this is a category that is appropriated and approved in the budget by the council. It can also be spent if we go through a proper process in local budget law to move it to another category. So this is kind of my example of, maybe Melinda has a capital project where she needs more funds to cover that because, the contractor, the bid came back way higher than anticipated, and there wasn't enough in her capital outlay budget to cover that. Then in this scenario, we could come back to the board, go through the process as outlined in local budget law, and essentially move dollars out of contingency into that capital line to be able to make those expenditures. So here's a little information about reserves versus ending fund balance. There's a couple ways to think about this. They're both sort of doing the same thing, but I would say ending fund balance is like the ending money in my checkbook balance at the end of the day. I want to have dollars in there, but not necessarily negatives. Negatives not good, but at least get to zero minimum. So this is like money and cash that you can carry forward to help fund the government and the city going forward. So we talked earlier about, hey, property taxes is the funding that usually helps the city operate from that period of time in July until November, where they're getting very little funding. And so you're waiting for property tax to come in until November. What's going to be the cash in the bank? What is going to carry you through that time? And what carries you through is that money that you've set aside in the unappropriated ending fund balance. Now, this is something that is not appropriated, meaning it's not in a line item appropriation to spend in local budget law. So that's a small difference, and it can't be used. So there's no prescribed method in local budget law to tap into these dollars. So very different from contingency that we described earlier, unless like the disaster happens. So if we have a true emergency that where we have disaster declarations, much like we did with wildfires or ice storms, or we get, say, the giant earthquake happens, then there is a prescribed exception for that particular case. A reserve for future expenditures is really similar, but slightly different. It is carried forward to subsequent fiscal years. So a lot of times I will see cities or governments go ahead and budget for reserves, meaning they're like, hey, I want to set this money aside for a future fiscal year and future purpose. And I think that can be a really powerful tool because you might know of something that is coming down the road that we need to be setting aside funds for. For example, if there is a known potential payout that is going to happen in the future. And I saw some governments do this with EPA, knowing, oh my gosh, the Equal Pay Act, I said EPA, the Equal Pay Act required some governments to make extensive payouts of retro pay to employees in order to implement that law in Oregon here. So a reserve to be able to cover cost. It could be a reserve for something that we are saving for in the future, a new building, perhaps. So that would kind of describe some uses of this. It's not really appropriated by the governing body either at the end of the day, but it can be moved through supplemental budget process. So there is a prescription, and a way to do that is to take a process back to the governing body, back to our council, and say, local budget law says we can use reserves to cover costs under these particular circumstances. And if the city can check the boxes, those dollars could be spent in the current fiscal year rather than having to wait till the next fiscal year. So this is a way to think about it. The other thing I have heard, folks, that is a recent trend amongst some of the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, they're talking about reserves also as, think about it as a really good thing, a healthy thing, like having an insurance policy. So what are we going to fall back on when something goes wrong? And so they're really encouraging local governments to look, again, looking more closely at reserves and making sure we have adequate reserves, because they want us to start thinking about it more of not just I'm saving for something in the future, but if something bad happens, what is going to carry us forward? What is going to make it so we can continue to operate, provide services for our residents? So thinking of it as an insurance policy might be a helpful way to consider this. So here's an example to see what this looks like. And I just realized the page numbering might be a little off. I do not remember if I updated that page 22. So I apologize if it's a little off and you're trying to open your budget book and it's not exactly page 22. But I wanted to just kind of put a snippet in here this year so you can see this example of what are we doing with contingency and reserves. So this is the general fund, which is a great example. It's obviously an operating fund. It has a whole lot of different departments in it. And the contingency proposed, we've got 331,000 and change. As far as reserve, a really healthy amount of money going to reserves actually increased from the prior year. And that's largely because the beginning fund balance is increased. So we had originally assumed that we were going to have beginning fund balances of about 1.5 million, ended up with about 1.8. And that was largely due to things like not having a city administrator in a position for the entire year, which created savings, which allowed the city to be able to save a little bit more and put that into that sort of category of insurance policy here of the 879,000. And then we have unappropriated ending fund balance. That is still budgeted at the 275,000. I'm not aware of any policy the city has around unappropriated ending fund balance, but I have seen a trend year to year of using this figure. And so just keeping with consistent practice. Okay, so real quick, we get to talk about overhead and operational overhead allocations. So what is the allocation methodology, and more importantly, what is being allocated at the city? So the general fund administration and city council expenses, that is being allocated out to the other funds and departments, essentially. So these are essential services that we have to have in order to run a government. So this kind of comes down to if you're running a business and you have overhead, right, you're going to have to pay a CPA. You're going to have a bookkeeper or something else. Someone's going to do something like that, right? So these are like critical costs that we have to have in order to run a city. And so those costs then are allocated out to the departments. So the departments have to have finance, right? They have to have HR, because if they don't have those things, there are no paychecks, there is no accounting. And so that's very common practice in government to allocate out those essential operations in order to be able to have a government out to those different operating departments that are more public facing. As far as departments that are paying overhead, the general fund does absorb some of the overhead costs for a few of these different departments that are listed here, but really what's noticeable is those more outward facing departments like the street and sewer and water funds. Those are transferring amounts and payments that remaining it back to the general fund to cover some of these overhead costs. And then as far as how is it allocated, it's based on each fund's operating expenses, excluding capital outlay. So it's a pro rata allocation. Pretty simple math at the end of the day. The reserve fund, yay. All right, so the reserve fund, this particular fund in Hubbard is where the city is saving for particular capital expenditures that they know they're going to need. So this is like the replacement fund of, hey, I know that we're going to need a new truck. So we're going to budget and save dollars for it every year until we have enough funds to go buy that new truck. And the city keeps track of each of these different needs by what was kind of appropriately titled up there as reserve buckets, more or less. I mean, there's a technical term for that in the accounting software, but reserve buckets makes it very simple to think of like, hey, I've got a bucket over here. We're putting some money in this year for this one. There's this one over here, putting in some money for this one for this year. And so as far as like what is actually happening this year, we do have plans to go ahead and spend some of those dollars to purchase a new pickup and a new mower. And the rest of the activity happening here is just a little bit of saving towards additional replacements, and then as well as holding dollars. The only additional income besides the transfers of funds to be able to save from the departments doing this is just that there's interest income. So any cash that's sitting in the bank there that's being held because we're going to save to buy a truck or carpet or whatever in the future, it does earn interest, and the interest is actually good right now, because although we have inflation, on the flip side, we have a really high interest rate environment. Not great for borrowing, but it is great for earning money. So kind of flip with the coin, you know, with some years it's one better to borrow. This is not the best year to take out debt, but it's a great year to be able to say, let's get some interest earnings on our cash. So talking about recommendations, I think as part of being a consultant's role, it's to also give advice on what is helpful and what's best practice. So this is kind of a continuation. Summer Sears, a prior consultant, had started this recommendation. And so this is just an update of prior recommendations. So the city has obviously filled that city administrator role. And we've got some check marks here on the recruit, the start, and now it's the use and the rely on is kind of the next phases of, you know, interacting with other resources and other colleagues to be able to gain information to really sort of transform and bring in current practices and best practices into the city. So, and then just also that relying on having that new manager and that trust. And so this really is going to be really for the governing bodies. This is really speaks to more of what the governing body has to do is they're sort of making this transformation a process. And we know none of this happens overnight. This is just kind of like a little reminder to keep this here. And I think it's great to sort of bring it back at budget time each year to revisit and see how is the city making progress. And then this is the current year recommendation is my current year recommendation is to achieve structural balance. So as we look at the budget, we do have a balanced budget, but we don't necessarily have a structurally balanced budget. So structural balance is a little bit different than just total resources equal total requirements. Structural balance really refers to, do we have enough operating revenue, so reoccurring revenues, to cover our reoccurring expenses, and making sure that those two are at least matching and even. And so what we're seeing nowadays in this environment and across the board with governments is that we don't have enough reoccurring revenue to cover the reoccurring expenses. And this is largely because the cost in personnel and then also the inflation environment that we're in is kind of causing that trend to just take off a bit more than what it was before. So recommendations would be to start looking at is adopt some fund balance policies, contingency and reserve policies to guide decision making. So I've kind of written put in a link here to GFOA's best practices where they offer that advice of how do you structure these policies? Because again, if you're trying to achieve structural balance, you're going to have parameters and guidelines that you work within. And so having, your city administrator kind of help lead the way to create these policies and bring them forward to the council for consideration will also help inform the budget process going forward. What are you trying to achieve? Where are we trying to go? So it's nice to say, oh, have a structurally balanced budget, but without having some parameters to work it within and guidelines, it's really hard to get there. And then what would you avoid? Well, we would avoid trying to use like one-time revenue sources to pay for ongoing operations. So examples of that would be like, if we were using grants, well, or insurance reimbursements or fund balance, well, those are one-time revenue sources. Like I will get a grant and it's going to cover this training or this personnel, but grants have end dates, start and an end date. So it's not an ongoing revenue source unless it's one of those ones that you can reapply for it year after year after year. And it constantly covers those costs. So there's the occasional exception in the grants world, but definitely fund balance. Once you spend it, it's gone. It's very much like that savings account that we have on a personal level of, hey, I've got my savings account. I can pay for this bill, right? My Visa bill right now with my savings account. What happens next month when I need to pay for the Visa bill again? But there's not money in my savings account anymore. So those are the kinds of things that we might want to avoid. Considering would be what kind of new revenue sources can we raise? Is there a levy that the voters would support? Common examples of things that voters support: parks, public safety. Those are the types of levies that usually voters will say, yeah, we want to fund public safety. We do value this in our community, right? Or we value parks in our community. Not likely they're going to value a levy for just operating costs of the general fund. That's not usually very popular. So things to think about, fee increases, new fees, also considering the vacancy rates and the forecasting. What is really, truly a realistic picture for going forward? Because that also may help balance out the forecast. And then of course, if you can hold the line on some things, for expenditure increases, there are some things you cannot control. We cannot control inflation. We cannot control PERS, unfortunately. There's some things that you can control, and so that's where adopting policies can be helpful. And that might even be looking at collective bargaining agreements, looking at things like setting limits on COLAs, of floors and ceilings, those are all helpful tools, again, to balance the budget. So with that, I have talked a lot. And so this is a great opportunity for me to go ahead and turn it over to the committee for questions, looking into the details of the budget book, any deliberation the committee would like to have. And so, Chair, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to you at this point.
I wrote down a few questions in my notes. So what are we looking at when we're full staff as far as costs each for a monthly?
Full staffing on a monthly level?
Yeah,
That is a good question. Hang on. I think we can do that. I do not have that calculated in front of me, but if I grab a calculator, I can give you the number. Hang on a second, and I will look at that. And in the meantime, is there any other questions or that the committee wants to look at?
Can I make a statement real quick? So I haven't met you, I'm Sean Weeks, I'm the city administrator. So one of the things, this is my first budget. And there's been some observations that I made. Ms. Wolf did talk to some of those. But for example, when we look at in the budget message, kind of that clip and this year, in particular, we're hitting that red mark. We're facing an operating deficit. We're not going to see that this year. And there's a couple of different things that I'm observing. One, we have several vacancies that we are saving personnel costs and costs on benefits. So we've had a couple in the police department for quite some time. We've had two and a half in public works. My position was vacant for most of the year. So we've seen significant salary savings. We also got spent a lot of our materials and services. I mean, we're seeing some savings there, even though, you know, over the last couple of years, inflation's been about 13% in materials and services. Things are finally starting to stabilize out, and we're seeing about 5%. Another thing that I've noticed over researching over the last 5 years is that we continually over budget expenditures and under budget our revenues. So like the auditor presented a couple of months ago, he said, you know, your ending funding balance keeps climbing. That is really the cause of we're not spending what we are projecting. And so there's more money that we're carrying over to a beginning funding balance. So just wanted to kind of give you an idea for this fiscal year, we are going to end in a positive operating balance. But again, not to discount what Ms. Wolf said, we do need to figure out something else for revenue streams because personnel costs are just going to continue to go up. So I just wanted to make.
and I get that. And then one of the concerns that I have and the question that I want to ask is because I understand saving the money is great, but as far as safety ramifications by being short staffed with officers, it kind of, for all the taxes that as community have to pay for personnel, it's kind of like, are we getting billed as a community the same monthly, regardless if we have the staff or not, as far as quick responses, emergencies like windstorms, ice storms kind of stuff? How are we looking at that from a resident perspective? Are we going to be getting billed the same monthly fees minus the resources that we have as far as officers and say, like, for example, public works, like with our, because we see those kind of deficits between the way the city is looking as far as parks, streets, kind of stuff like that, that we pay taxes as a community for. I'm just new to this kind of stuff. I figured I just want to ask questions for the community and stuff, and how much money we're saving by not having all those positions filled each month, and what it's costing. Because I'm just curious, because I'm new to this, like I said. I just want to, I think it's really cool with all these numbers, but I also want to know how much does it cost when we're fully staffed compared to how much does it get cost with us missing like 2 officers and 2.5 public works employees per month on the budget? And
Ms. Wolf, did you have an opportunity to pull what the monthly fully, cost would be for fully staffed?
Yeah, so if we look at if we annualize the 2.2 million set aside currently, it's budgeted for full cost of personnel, assuming all positions filled on a monthly basis, it's about $184,000. And so keep in mind that's fully loaded, all benefits, all taxes associated with that personnel. So it's not just their salary, it's everything associated with personnel.
So if I might address a question that you brought up, and that is, we don't have a variable tax rate for fees. Right, so if a police officer quits, public works quit, our tax revenue, our fees don't variably adjust. That would be an absolute nightmare to try to manage that type of a tax system, get along unmanageable. What happens though, and what was being mentioned up here, is that unrecognized expense, for lack of a better term, it does carry forward. So think of it like it does go into if you would, a savings account, we carry it forward and we still keep it in the bucket it needs to go to. And hopefully that cushions some of it, like city administrator Wade was just mentioning is right now, we're not going to see this fiscal cliff in the deficit. We didn't spend all the money from last year. We had vacated positions. So we have a cushion that we're going to come into. It doesn't change the fact that in all reality, we do need to adjust spending. We need to find ways to save money. But at the end of the day, actually having a vacant position, although it's detrimental to the group that has to have it, whether it's public works or whether it's the police department, we need more police officers. It's a benefit to the community because it is money that they're actually saving in the sense that that expense allows it to carry forward a little longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're looking for is, no, we don't have a, hey, we lost the public works guy, so your next month's water bill is going to be 0.2% less or whatever it might be.
because then there's a lot of people asking questions on the community site when the water was pouring over the tower, when it's leaking, they said, how much money is it gonna cost our community from all that water we lost that was leaking? Remember, you guys seen all those comments from that? So I'm wondering, like, that
I
kind
thought we
of,
should just park all the trucks underneath.
Right. Put some barrels and then use it for reserves.
No, honestly, that's costing us lost revenue in terms of water being lost, but it's revenue we never recognized or accounted for. Really, what it's costing us is the electricity pumping the water up there so it can pour over.
Yeah.
So it's not like the city is getting a water bill for 50,000 gallons of water that spilled. But it is more expensive to keep doing that than it is to upgrade the SCADA systems, I would think.
Yeah, it was a problem with the electronic equipment that actually runs the plant. We were having some issues with it, so yeah, we got it fixed, but it's a Band-Aid fix. I mean, the equipment we're using there is 23 years old, so.
What's it cost to update the system far as, and are we budgeted for those parts? And
Again, it is part of the water plant upgrade that we've got almost finished with the engineering at this stage.
So I just have a few questions generally on the overall budget. So I don't know who I asked the question to.
Technically the budget officer, but I may not be able to,
Okay.
not stop it.
So I'll first say it loud, so it can all be through.
If I promise, if I don't know the answer, I will defer to Hubbard staff. So
There you go. It'll bounce around. Someone might answer it.
Yes.
I understand the contingency then from last year to this year is going up because we're tagging it at 15%. Is that what we're doing? Okay.
Yes.
And I noticed our reserve ending funding balance also went up. That'd be good. Curious on council expenses, 17.9 last year, 14.9. What are we spending these council expenses on?
Ooh, I am going to defer to Vicky on that because I believe she has a very good handle on those costs.
Yeah, you're not in the room and everyone already looked at her.
Yeah, she's already working on it.
I mean, I know we're expensive. I actually have no clue what we'd be spending that
I thought you
on.
were going first.
Well, I know there's training opportunity, training expenses in there as we get into the council. But other than that, I'm not sure.
I mean, is it paying for printout?
We've taken some of that money, donated some of that money in the past? We already had some.
Not in the 5 years I've been in this role, but I can.
No.
5 or 6 years.
Something we donated some.
Yes, you did, you donated money for the Ox Festival.
Okay.
And, you have legal fees, council orientation, which is also legal fees.
Got it.
Community staff relations, some training, you have costs in there for training, mayor's association, dues. There's some printing and office, charges in there.
So probably the biggest expense it would be when we're talking with Ashley or Emily, when we're dealing with a council specific topic. On page 23, under franchise fees, I see PGE, Quest, Northwest Natural. I don't see Comcast. Should they not be on there?
Didn't Comcast have a name change?
They did,
I went through everything, but I don't think any of these would be Comcast.
Us down.
No,
Yeah,
that's
they're-
way.
that way.
So I will offer that I have not seen Comcast make payments in the few months of accounting that I provided for the city. The PGE, the Quest, the Northwest Natural, some of the other ones, I've seen those come in and be deposited. So that's really much all I can offer for without doing research for an answer for right now.
I will look into that.
Thing, because I know they've been operating for at least 2 years, I think, within the cities when they finished off, so they've got to have at least a full calendar year. So, I had a question on lane searches, but that's just, it's going to be more expensive because people are more expensive now. On the reserve fund side, I know it's a little bit further in, I do apologize for this. Page 39. I'm assuming for the tractor mower, we've had that in discussion for some time at Public Works, but I don't recall us ever putting funds aside. It doesn't look like we had anything really budgeted much in the past. Same thing with a Public Works pickup for 40 grand this year, but nothing in reserve last year. So is this a new request going or are we saving from this year that goes into the next fiscal year?
Basically, what happened with the mower is we bought one. Actually, we got 2 5 years ago. And because of the way the budgets have been, we haven't been putting a whole lot away. We've come to the conclusion that we need new mowers now because they're falling apart. So that's why you're seeing such a large chunk go out this year where we didn't put any in last year.
We just buy that new zero turn mower though? Is it
It's
5 years?
6 years, that was the last year Jamie bought. And the John Deere 7 years old.
No warranties on that, I don't,
No, it's too old.
I didn't know how old the warranties are. 5 years seemed like we were pretty right at it.
I think on both of them, 18 months is about all you're gonna get. And we're working hard, so.
So what about the pickup truck though?
They're again, basically the same story, and we've come to the conclusion that we need to replace the 030.
When you say when you say we, like who are you talking about? We, who's
Public
we?
Works Department.
Okay, so you and Melinda, or you, like who's deciding that?
I am.
Okay. So you said we, so that's
Right. I generally talk about as the department.
But my only question on that one, is it a must have or a nice to have? Like concern would be is we do need to really start watching what we're spending. We can see that. So can a truck with 5,000, say in repairs or a tune-up or whatever it might be still run, considering we're not driving too much?
Yes, but it's in pretty bad condition. The steering wheel's falling apart, the seats are falling apart, we've got rust spots in the bed. We bought it new in 2003.
20 years old, it's an old truck.
Yeah, it's an old truck and it's had its uses, and we do plan to keep it around for the paint thing. So when they're painting sidewalks, curbs, it tends to get a little bit on the decorated side, and we don't want one of the newer trucks to have that kind of abuse to it. So it'd be a utility that we really don't care what happens to it at the time. So it does still have its value, but I don't think that it's gonna last much longer for a daily driver.
So-
Still underground. You're still gonna take funds to keep it, to tune it up, and for maintenance and all that.
Yeah, for when we're using it, which is approximately 2 months out of the year.
How many vehicles don't get driven? I mean, how many total vehicles we have and how many just stays parked is, because I'm just curious, because you got a truck that you drive, Melinda has a truck that she drives. And how many vehicles are being used out of all our arsenal and how many's being parked? And is there any way the ones that's being parked can transition into the 2003 truck? Just save expenses there rather than getting it replaced, or I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just saying. And so we can get like money to whatever, to your question.
Right, no, I understand what you're saying. Every truck we've got, and I'm trying to think of the number, I believe there's 6. The only one that we don't use as a daily driver was one of the employees is actually driving at this point, or will be assigned when we fill our vacancies, is the crane truck. And the reasons why with the crane truck, it is just too big to get into some
I
location.
get it, yeah.
Are
You
those
get it?
trucks used
Oh.
for private use?
No. They're parked. I do take mine home on occasion, but that's only if I believe there may be some sort of a situation where I might be called back, and it's a matter of quicker response at that point. I did take my truck home over Memorial Day weekend with the fact that there was some questions whether or not we'd have problems with the black line.
And I do want to point out real quick, so on page 39 of the reserve page, there is a line and it's in blue where it says reserve for future expenditures and it's 127,823. There are funds that in that amount that were budgeted in this current fiscal year that include the tractor and also trucks. So this is in addition. I can provide you more detail on what's in that number as well.
So the new
Can you
truck,
Again, that 127, that's in addition to this 55?
So there's multiple other things that make up that 127. And so I think it might be easier. So the 127 consists of a reserve amount for a dump truck of $8,955. Reserve for a backhoe, $22,740. Tractor mower, $11,806. The pickup, $34,289. The new police department, city hall building, $35,988. Public work utility truck with crane, $11,590. City sewer line, $2,458.
Right.
I'll have the crane truck in there on the reserve. I thought I already bought, so.
So can I interject a little bit
Go ahead,
here?
go ahead. So I know you're not.
So- Well, we kind of like we talked about earlier in the presentation. So that reserve for future expenditures means that the city is dedicating dollars and saving towards replacing these items, right? So when you see that 127,000 that Sean just kind of detailed the list of what are we saving for, it doesn't mean that there's an intent to purchase those items in this fiscal year. Because remember, reserve means you're going to spend it someday down the road, but not this coming fiscal year. We're not talking FY24. We're talking 25, 26, 27, 28, 30, whatever, right? So this is the department saying, and letting the committee know they have an intent to use these dollars towards these things in the future. And this is the product of the department saving over time that's accumulated those funds versus the total capital outlay for the 15,000 for the mower and the public works pickup. Those have been identified as potential needs and expenditures for this this proposed budget period, right? Now we're looking at something that, you know, Director Krebs is talking about. Hey, I have these operational needs and I would need to purchase these vehicles between, you know, July 1st and June 30th of the upcoming year. And then I did want to just note too, that on the tractor mowers, I know that 5 or 6 years might not sound old, but equipment is measured in terms of hours for usage. So equipment hours and usage is really that factor that needs to be looked at rather than years. So maybe keep that in mind. And the vehicles, 20 years as well, you have to look at the mileage and the usage of it, because hard use and mileage is also key in those situations too.
Yeah, and Mike's defense, working for Amazon, and we opened up in August last year with brand new vans in the fleet. And there, some of our vans are trash. I mean, we're missing parts on the vans, damaged, wear and tear from delivery, getting into the things. And as a resident of Hubbard, and my concern is being put in work for Amazon, the safety of the vehicle, and then to try to get these vehicles fixed and have to pull teeth to get them. My concern for people at home that, man, steering wheel's falling apart. That's just a lawsuit waiting to happen. If somebody gets in a wreck, we wipe somebody out due to all of our vehicles not being up to par. I mean, it's a liability for sure. And I see your concern there, Mike, because steering wheel, anything that's not proper, and if it's been reported to council, the defects on the vehicles, then it makes us mandatory to look into those fixed, so we don't have a problem down the road with any of the vehicles.
So not that, my little trying to wrap my head around this. So we put in for this upcoming budget, 34,000 already for a new pickup. But we're also looking at adding 40,000 more to that.
And that was my question, is the $34,000 something we've already saved up towards the $40,000? So we really only need $6,000 more?
So ideally, what we need to put in place is a fleet replacement schedule, which that's something we don't really have in place as a city. So it's cheaper for us to start saving now to be able to replace vehicles down the road than, I mean, as you know, trucks in particular, they're upwards to 40 to 70,000
And more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and more.
So the $34,000 is towards a future truck, not this current truck.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
So combined, that would be that'd be what, 40, 50, 60, $74,289 in that line item after this year. And then that means next fiscal year, 24, 25, then we might be able to purchase that replacement truck. So, 2 years down the road by the time we get enough money in there to do something with. If you're talking, even your basic pickup, like I said, $70,000, you could go up to 100,000 if you needed extra, to be able to carry extra weight, the heavy duty ones, that type of stuff, without too much trouble at all. These days. I'd like to get a truck, but I can't afford one.
We buy through the state purchasing. So the state qualifies these people, they give a discount for the municipality, and that's generally who we buy it from. And there's usually a list of 4 or 5 that you can go and talk to, and then we'll pick the one that gives us the cheapest price off of that.
And could you repeat your question? You were talking, so I couldn't.
I'm sorry. I asked Mike if there was a particular dealer that we can go through that gives us a good deal.
Thank you.
And to answer your question there, they both have hour meters on. I don't have those numbers, but
Yeah, I wouldn't pick it off the top of your head. But yeah, I know my John Deere died after like 70. Stupid question. What do we use our parks improvement fund for? For 5 years, I've never figured that out. What is that used for?
So I don't know details right off hand. I'm still learning.
Well, that's fine. 5 years later, I'm still learning. That's why I'm asking the question. I see this.
It sounds like a Melinda question to me.
It does. Mike, do you have?
Yeah, part of the improvement fund, I believe, is the money we put away for things like, replacing the, tennis courts, the lighting systems that we're talking about going
Oh,
around,
that's right, yeah.
walkways, mountain park, things like that. If we need to replace the covered area, roughly, we come out of that. So yeah, it's major outlay stuff that we're looking at possibly in the future, but we don't have enough money to do that.
Did it start out with the volunteer group that did the parks remodel back with Hildred days?
I don't know, to be honest with you.
It seems like they started their own nonprofit, and then when they turned it over to the city, it became the Parks Improvement Fund line.
So that could be, that's a good point, because, as we talk about what's happening with the Veterans Memorial, this is where it's going. So it is kind of a dedicated fund for those types of activities.
Right, and you have a separate line item already listed on page 42 for that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to pick on public works, by the way, I'm just looking for areas that, as we go into the next fiscal year, we do need to find areas that we need to start control costs.
I understand that, but one of the things that, Public Works is looking at this point is that the, two remaining trucks that we have are older and falling apart. We've got the 2003 that we've got to be replacing as soon as, because we said it's got issues, and I believe the maintenance cost on it going forward wouldn't be worth a while to sustain. The second one is the service truck, which is a 2006. So generally what happens in public works, unlike the police department, where they run through them every 3 years, we keep ours for 20. We literally run the wheels off of them. So we've got into a little bit, I'm not gonna say a jam, but we're in a little bit of a necessity now to replace at least one of them, because we won't have enough vehicles, safety wise and mechanical wise to, when we do get our third guy hired, we won't be any way for him to travel around. We'll have to put him on the new lawnmower.
That can work, and cut the grass while he's not really the budget committee, but something we can line up in the future in terms of expenditures on it as well, is what is the city's plan in terms of converting our eventual fleet to electric?
Have not had that conversation yet.
Only reason I'm asking is if you're looking at buying a truck here, they're gonna start making it harder and harder to purchase fuel. And it might be something, and we might get incentives if we look at, it's right, it's driving less than 300 miles around the city, I'm assuming. They can charge overnight, so there's something to look into, unless you're hauling a lot of weight.
Right.
Power
Yeah,
in a
well,
freak storm.
that's what we got the backup generator for. But just something that, for us, the future, talk about in the council too.
I'd be very open to that discussion.
I've been talking a lot, so.
Oh, I have a question, I think.
Charles, this might not be even a budget question, but at, 2 council meetings ago, when Linda, asked the city to take over for the Veterans Memorial. Excuse me. And, at that meeting, the Veterans Memorial was granted, a $5,000 grant. And she gave it back, and within seconds, the council had already had those funds allocated to a new phone system. My question was that grant for a 501c specifically, or was it just a general grant?
The ARPA funds were allowed for a very specific purpose, and it was a very fine line on there, but upgrading our phone systems actually was allocated within those funds. So we were able to upgrade our, because it can go for emergency responses and both communication purposes where it was.
Okay,
So, right. So one of the reasons we actually, and I know this is probably not for the budget committee here, reasons we wanted to try to give back in terms of some of those ARPA funds to some of the nonprofits for what they were doing. To help them out, because we know they also took donation hits during that time. Yeah, so when they turned the money back, we wanted to make sure we used it for appropriate use, and upgrading the phone system is definitely a good use of that.
okay.
In the past, we have asked as council members, what can we, as a budget, do up front visually for our citizens to see that the city's behind them, such as street repair. I mean, everybody loves it when they see the street getting repaired. So we really have pushed to try to get that to the forefront. Are we any closer to still doing that, or are we having to back off on something?
I don't think we're having to back off on some of that. We're not there yet. And so we're gonna be going into a goal setting, priority setting session, January, February timeframe. That's really gonna help us prioritize our funds better, going into next budget season. But no, those are not off the table at this point.
Because that's one reason why the city hall's been upgraded a little bit. It's something that the community can see, signage that shows us. So, I mean, we're not looking at cutting any street repairs or sidewalk stuff. We want to continue to make sure that those are the things at the forefront.
What about potholes?
Yeah, potholes.
I think we've got working on A Street over here going on
Yep.
right now.
From the SCA grant, yeah.
Yeah, and then we added I was going back looking at my emails and added a third section.
Yeah, the one block section between, F and G on Fifth.
Yeah.
We did a while back, we did, storm drainage up to, F Street. And then we did a couple of years ago, the paving and sidewalk from G to J. And that one block section, just, we couldn't find enough money for it at the time we did the, ladder section, which is, G to F, so we had a little extra money this time, and we're gonna add it in, so getting new pavement and sidewalks along that. And that will take you all the way to the, both ends of town with a pretty decent sidewalk.
So probably just for those that aren't in our day-to-day activities at the city, about 4 years ago, no, maybe 5 years, no, about 3 or 4 years ago, we did have a goal setting session where we set some very specific guidelines we wanted the city to go with the budget, because we wanted some guiding principles. The top one was the static water pressure issue that we're having. Everyone knows we have really bad water pressure. And I'm assuming this budget's probably taking and continuing that pressure forward. That's the number one priority. The second priority was sidewalks and street, making sure it's safe, fixing the potholes where we can, putting sidewalks where we can. Back last year, one of the things that we specifically did was we upped the reimbursement that the city does from $300 to I think about $1,500. So it really helps offset the cost of sidewalk.
From tree roots, things like that.
Yes, exactly. And then this year, for those that have been to our city council meetings, they would hear us probably consistently asking, Public Works for just an update on how many, more sidewalks are in the inventory to be repaired, or how what's the progress on it. In fact, working on it's kind of nice. You'll see little new patches of sidewalk here and there. Just little things, try to make it for everyone around town.
I like along the railroad tracks with the railroad did a really good job clearing that out. That'll definitely keep the homeless out.
Where are we at on the agenda?
Yeah. Right now, we're still on discussion. Any other discussion topics on the budget? I've already asked you the question.
Can I ask one other dumb question, I guess? Along Main Street, between Hubbard Shell and 99, the rocks, the slate, the little pots and stuff that are growing beautiful, tall weeds. Who's responsible for that?
The, adjacent, property owner.
Who put them in?
Pretty good.
Did you ask the property owner to be responsible for that?
Can I call for a point of order? We're so far off, like, these are not budget meeting concerns.
Okay,
Can we move back to-
that's fair. Should get back to the budget. Does anyone else have any questions that are specifically related to the budget?
I had a question, as far as, I know we've been seeing a lot of overtime because of staffing. Other people are filling in extra hours, and I appreciate it, but I also noticed we raised the overtime, and we're also budgeting as if we have a full staff. Once we have a full staff, will that overtime still be higher anticipated going forward?
Are you talking about the police overtime?
I think police did. for
There,
sure.
it isn't actually raised. Back when I started, there was 10,000 in overtime. And officers they can only take comp time. And at the end of the year, they were getting paid out vacation time. And, or comp time or holiday time, right? Holiday time. And they were saving as banks and stuff like this. So I presented to council that we need to increase in the overtime budget. I said, we pay as we go. And if you look at the officers, comp time, none of them have comp time anymore. They want the overtime. And so we budgeted 30. I think 2 budgets ago, we went down to 20. And then I asked for it back. And then went to 30. 12, it's 43. So the state also gives a bunch of grants. We call them ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation. And those are for seatbelt. I can't believe they still pay grants for that, but they do. And then distracted drivers, big one, DUI, speed enforcement, and then pedestrian crosswalks. So we applied for the grants, and we just sent it in yesterday. And we think there's going to be 12 or 13,000, right? Well, 2 years ago they gave us 26.5, and last year they gave us 22. So that's why the budget, the overtime budget on the police side has not increased from last year. It's the same.
Okay.
But we may get more revenue in because the state might give us more money. But we anticipate 12,000, and that's why 12,000 is on the expense and the revenue side.
So, well, even though it's not a general fund expense though, because we have those grant dollars coming in to offset that expense. And so that's one example where, we're understating our revenue sources and kind of overstating our expenditures. So getting those trued up a little bit, I think will help tell a better story.
That's what I was curious, if that's one of those examples. Yeah.
So, but we haven't been backfilling, right, where there's 4 of us. There was an increase in the contract. The officers got a 3-hour callback instead of a 2-hour callback. So that's another hour that comes out of overtime, and that's like if they go to court. There was a homicide down in Woodburn. Officer Bentley and I were stuck on the crime scene, and I called Mark White. He came in for 2 hours, but it's 3 hours paid for. And this is just contract to cover our city when we were stuck down there. So, but yeah, we run short a lot. It's unfortunate, but yeah, but we don't backfill much patrol overtime at all.
Okay.
All right, any other questions? Okay. So are we on continued public hearing?
Yeah, we're on number 5, public hearing for the state shared revenue.
All right, public hearing for the state shared revenue.
We need to start with that.
That
You're opening the hearing. You're opening the public hearing in state share revenue, so you say.
Okay, we are opening the hearing on
State share revenue.
state shared revenues.
Go back to the
Thank
budget.
Thank you, Chair. That's perfect. So yes, so this is exactly what I was going to ask next, if we were ready to go ahead and open that public hearing. So maybe you're officially your time where you can use the gavel and open the public hearing and close the public hearing. So
All right.
with that, I will go
We're
ahead.
open.
Yes, I will go ahead and go back to the presentation and we'll take a look at this. So public hearing, state shared revenues. So cities are qualified to receive state shared revenues if they provide specific services outlined in ORS. And the city of Hubbard does qualify for this, as they have continued to do so for many years. And they're meeting the requirements that are outlined. So we have police protection being provided, street construction maintenance. We have sewer and storm services, utilities such as water, and then of course, planning, zoning, and subdivision control. These are all qualifying activities. And so it's good to kind of go over the state shared revenues and inform those if anyone there is from the public is attending, and we're just going to kind of walk through these of what are these revenue streams and what are they looking like to provide that transparency and information. So within the different funds that the city has, again, these are accounting funds, not necessarily dollars, We have the general fund, and it is receiving revenue sharing, cigarette tax. We have our OLCC dollars, so liquor dollars, right, from the liquor taxes, and then we have marijuana state and local taxes. We have in the proposed budget 133,000, and as I mentioned earlier, again, these taxes, we are provided information on a per capita basis for those that are allocated on a per capita basis to be able to calculate and have a reasonable estimate of what is going to come in. And as you can see, we do have an increase proposed from the prior year, 2023. We have an amended budget total of $124,540. So you're seeing an increase there. And that is largely because we're seeing figures from OLCC that are increasing. We're seeing some minor change in the state and local marijuana tax as well, although you'll note if you look back to 2021, this is still a huge blow and reduction in marijuana tax, and that is because the state legislature decided to change the payment structure, and when they changed it, unfortunately, it was in favor of the state government and not so much in favor of the municipalities, as you can see. So we are still dealing with that impact. And then you can see currently there is also some state charge revenue that is being received. You'll see it's being split 20,000 between the general fund and 20,000 between park improvement fund. That is an allocation that has been created by Hubbard city's staff. And so that is consistent with prior years, in that half of that revenue is being put towards future park improvements as a way of funding those improvements, like the tennis court project or something else that was on the list that Director Krebs mentioned. And then you have, we have gas tax, of course, also really important for funding our roads and road improvements, as you all, the committee were discussing those earlier. So again, we're continuing to see that trend upwards, not surprising with the cost of gas going up. Again, while electric vehicles are around, we're not seeing a significant impact in reducing consumption at this time. So we'll kind of see how that trends over time. Now, you will notice some difference when you look at the actuals for prior years there in 2021 and 2022. And not that you're seeing really a difference in total, but between these two funds, there is an allocation of what is allocated to street construction and what is allocated to the street fund itself. And that allocation, again, that is made by staff, and you'll see kind of a difference, and that's largely because the percentage change. So originally there was a 70-30 split, and then it changed to a 65-35. And so this split does change over time as staff determines needs. And so with that, that concludes my presentation on state shared revenue. Chair, are there any questions?
Does anyone have any questions? No. No questions.
All right, and Chair, the only thing I would ask is there any, you might ask if there's any public comments.
Are there any public comments at this time?
No.
Okay, then we will close the public hearing on revenue sharing. And we will open the public hearing on the 2023 to 2024 budget.
Awesome. Let me move forward and we'll talk about this. So today and this evening, we have gone over in detail the process of the proposed budget. And so we've talked about allocations, we've talked about methods, we've talked about different funding sources and changes and trends. And we presented that on a high level today. So, and overall, the city is currently presenting a proposed budget of $12.9 million, and the budget, it is balanced and it complies with Oregon local budget law. At this point, I would ask if there are any additional questions that I can answer for the committee or the public.
Does anyone have any questions? No, no questions? Then we will close the public hearing on the budget. And is there
All
a
right.
report on the tax levy rate?
So this kind of brings us down to final actions from the budget committee. So Chair, at this point, you might ask your committee if there is any additional deliberation that needs to be had to get to the point of making a motion and taking a vote on these items. The final two motions that'll need to be made is, of course, imposing the rate for the levy. So that way the city can collect property taxes from the next year. And if and when the city is ready to do that, you just go ahead.
No question then, in terms of the franchise fees for Comcast, if it's missing, do we approve the budget and come back and revisit that? Or is that something that we need to wait?
So that is something that I will need to look into, and then we can always correct it in supplemental.
I agree. I'm absolutely agree with Sean. I think it's a very small dollar amount. Again,
Yeah.
additional revenues can come in during the course of the year, and that is not an issue that necessarily requires a supplemental budget. It would be if you need to spend those dollars and we need to look at an appropriation category where maybe there's no current expenditure authority, but collecting additional revenues beyond and above what was budgeted, A-okay.
So if there was an adjustment, that adjustment could be made and go goes before the council. That adjustment could be made at that meeting on the 21st. Is that correct, or does the budget committee need to be present?
No, it could be made in front of council later on, or it certainly could be made during the course of the year. And at this point, I would recommend it just be made during the course of the year if necessary.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, I don't think I'll have time to look into it.
Sure, Comcast would like to still be somehow.
Right.
Good. But
Well, and just side note, franchise fees is something that I'm going to be looking into. Under state law, we are allowed to collect up to a certain percentage. We're way under that. So it is something that, for an additional revenue source that I'll be looking into. I'm sure they're not going to be.
I'm sure. Need a motion on my bill.
All right, so do we have a motion then to approve the
Excellent.
tax levy rate?
I make the motion, we approve. The second rate as stated.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, it has passed.
Let's move on to the budget.
So now we will move on to the budget for 2023 to 2024. Is there a motion to approve the budget?
Make the motion.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. Krista, don't they need to state the tax levy rate amount?
Yes.
For approval?
Oh, okay.
I make a motion.
So, yeah, my recommendation would be to basically read what is on the slide in the motion. I did note that someone said as stated, which may be close enough to say as presented, but it would be best to just read it off the slide and go from there. Yeah.
Okay, I make a motion to impose the property tax levy of $3.9772 per 1,000 of assessed value. To pass to approve the budget. Property taxes.
A second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we will move on to approving the budget for 2023 to 2024.
I make a motion to approve the FY 2023-2024 proposed budget of $12,917,182.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? You're opposed?
I'm sorry, who was opposed?
I'm opposed.
Okay.
Do we talk about it when we have a vote?
Yes.
Yes, you can ask if there's any further discussion.
All right, so it has been passed by the majority.
Krista, I'm sorry, did you say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say that if, prior to the, vote being called, you can always ask for further discussion. But yeah, I mean, if it will pass by a majority. So with the majority votes yes in favor, then you have successfully approved a budget.
Can I ask what your objection is?
The $40,000 on top of the 35,000. For pickup, 7 square mile city.
And how do you propose to fix that? What?
I'm not sure that a brand new pickup is something that's, I mean, we didn't buy a brand new crane truck. And I just think that was a little excessive at 75,000 this year.
I think it's a good topic to line up for a future council session, because I would like to see us have a much more planned approach.
Still have to appropriate something, right? I mean, the money could be in there.
Yeah, it can still fit there. That's it. That's right. What I heard, we're not probably gonna spend it. We're still safe.
Well, you can make policy decisions
Yes.
based on that, and it's in a reserve fund, so although we've earmarked it for certain things, we still have some flexibility.
I agree. There's a topic to have there, to be honest. Yes. Okay. One more to go.
Awesome.
Turn it to adjourn.
Excellent. We're adjourned then.
Oh, well,
All in favor?
congratulations.
Sorry.
Aye.
I'm going to extend it another hour to it's literally sitting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I took it off. Looked at it.
Oh, they made a motion to adjourn.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to wait, like-
Yeah.
I'm gonna sign off. Congratulations, everyone.
Yeah. Sure.
It's have one of these.